Hello everyone, welcome to the Yogascapes in Japan podcast series. My name is Amy McCartney. Yogascapes in Japan is a 2-year project funded by the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science and is hosted by the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Kyoto University, Japan. The aim of this project is to understand and document the popularity and consumption of global yoga within the Japanese cultural setting. In November 2018, we organised a 2-day international conference with the help of the Institute of Liberal Arts at Shisha University and the Organisation for Identity and Cultural Development. This podcast series showcases some of the presentations from the conference. Today's episode features Constanza Travaglia, who is a master's student from Heidelberg University, Germany. Her presentation is an overview of her future PhD research. The topic of her research is about global yoga, yoga festivals, and identity.
Thank you very much. Hello, I hope you can all hear me. So, I also just finished my master's in medical anthropology and South Asian studies. And this is my presentation or proposal for a future research project, possibly a PhD, or let's see. And it's called Yoga Festivals, Spectacularizing the Self. So this is my overview. In my introduction, I will just present my research project and my objectives by presenting first a very brief and general historical overview from earlier forms of meditative yogic practice to yoga as a modern tool for global well-being. And I want to point out from the beginning that when we say yoga, there is no monolithic definition of yoga, as it has always been characterized by mobility, hybridity, and social negotiability. So also when talking about the historical overview of yoga, there is no clear-cut shift from ancient to modern forms, but there was a gradual passage from what we can see as a form of secrecy to aspects of commodification of yoga. And I look at the aspect of self-realization, which can be seen also in many ways, either as an aesthetic goal or as a socio-political and a commercial strategy, or as both combined. So I look at yoga festivals as global arenas for performing a transnational ideal of a yogic self, and I will look at this ideal of yogic self more, which is central for my research. My methods are ethnographic, so mostly participant observation, literary, but also looking at the media. So I will also start with a quote. So what is yoga? And we'll take the Newcomb's recently published work, where she says that if we inquire more into where yoga is practiced and what people are doing with their practices rather than what yoga is, we might find more space for dialogue. It is only by considering yoga in precise locations that statements about yoga's significance and effects can have any meaning. So it's a more down-to-earth approach towards yoga, I think. So now starts the very general overview of historical yoga. In the early definitions, specifically in the Rig Veda, yoga refers to the yoke placed on a draft animal to tie it to a chariot used in times of war, so it was linked to a warrior ideology. And in the Mahabharata, specifically in the Bhagavad Gita, the warrior who knew he was about to die was said to become yoga yukta, or literally yoked to yoga. And I take these quotes from White's Brief History of an Idea. In the Katha Upanishad, which is the earliest systematic account of yoga, there is the story of Yama and Nachiketas, where yoga is said to be a self-meditation to find the eternal Atman and liberation, or moksha. And there is the comparison between the body, the mind, and the intellect with, again, the chariot image with the horses and the rider and the chariot. So again here, the main idea is the identification between the individual soul with the absolute being, or Brahman, and whose aim is, again, individual liberation. If we look at Buddhist and Jain sources, yoga, the word yoga doesn't appear, but it's mostly referred to as vipassana or gyan. But still, the practice it refers to can be seen as a form of yoga, interpreted as an analysis of the causes of suffering and the exposition of the means of salvation. So it involves a necessary detachment from sense impressions, including the mind. And again, here the final aim is that of kaivalya, or the final state of a fully liberated soul, with attention to the breath as a tool to calm the mind. Again, the Bhagavad Gita refers to yoga as a form of discipline or path, and in this text, the term yoga is preceded by an adjective or a modifier like jnana, karma, and bhakti yoga. And specifically, karma yoga is still relevant in modern society as it involves different aspects related to action and renunciation. So, by this very brief overview, we can find some common elements of the early sources of yoga, which see yoga as a form of individual practice aimed at raising consciousness and suppressing the lower apparatus of human perception in order to attain higher levels of existence, knowledge, and insight into the ultimate nature of reality. So the important elements here are that of yoga being an individual practice related to consciousness and aimed at ultimate knowledge and ultimately at liberation. Then, of course, there's the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali. And there are different views about Yoga Sutras, whether they are mostly referred to liberation or to ethics or to both. For example, Joseph Alter says that Yoga Sutras are oriented towards transcendence, magic, and immortalities, and that yamas and niyamas are not socially valued ends in themselves. Also, yamas are concerned with the relationship between the individual and societies, while niyamas are instructions for individual self-discipline. So I asked myself how to draw the lines between public and private, but also between sacred and profane when talking about yoga, and specifically Yoga Sutras. Again, a quote by Newcomb. She says that she asks whether yoga, is it primarily internal or external? Is it for public presentation or a matter of sacred inner contemplation and experience? And maybe we can discuss this later. Also, asanas in the Yoga Sutras are mostly seated, so the body doesn't really appear too much in the Yoga Sutras. In fact, yogic posture practice does not primarily consist of assuming a certain bodily configuration, but of a complex combination of psychophysiological practices that enable the practitioner to take up further means on the path to spiritual liberation. So again, here we are still in the part of seeing yoga as meditative practice aimed at transcendence and liberation. Until medieval forms of yoga, and specifically Hatha yoga, develop, when more bodily oriented forms of yoga start to become more popular. So Hatha yoga is mostly focused on tapas and arising kundalini and reversing the flow of semen or bindu. And it was interestingly initially transmitted orally by ascetics and then codified and given to a wider public of non-ascetics. And still it referred to individual practices, preferably to be performed individually in remote localities like in forests or apart from mainstream societies. So the main actors of Hatha Yoga were the Nath Sampradaya or community of ascetics. It was the only ascetic group to self-identify as yogis, and the aims of the Nath were that of bodily immortality, supernatural powers or siddhis. But they also interacted with the society and specifically with the Mughal emperors, so they became more and more socially engaged. And they were also referred to as yogi warriors and often identified with the Sufi fakirs, which gave them ambiguity, and both they were both admired and feared. So Hatha Yoga has been referred to also as the internalization of ritual by Joseph Alter, who argued that Hatha Yoga is the internalized form of the classic Vedic fire sacrifice, or an embodied physical philosophy, whose goals are that of immortality, transcendence, and self-deification. So again here, a detachment from the world is involved, which is seen as an internal offering of the sense of I. So if Vedic sacrifice was before external and an inherently social practice between humans and the gods, now the gods are not relevant anymore, because the sacrifice is enacted within the body itself of the practitioner. So for this reason, Alter says that Hatha Yoga is definitely and structurally antisocial and the antithesis of everything human, which is interesting when looking at yoga today as something deeply social and as something that is seen as a tool to make someone more human, but we will look at this more later. So coming to modern yoga, you all know these three people, Swami Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Gandhi. They were part of the so-called yoga revival of the 19th century, where yoga became part of modernization reforms as a national, medical, and scientific tool for individual and national liberation. So the body became an anti-colonial tool. And the figure of the socially engaged sannyasin or renunciant also became more and more popular against modernization or colonialism, and with aspects like celibacy being a tool against westernization. And so the main idea here is that self-discipline, taking care of one's own body and mind, reflects national and political independence as well. So in the 1920s, there is the so-called asana revival with Krishnamacharya, Kubalayananda, and Yogendra and others, focusing more on the physical aspects of yoga and as well as the medical aspects and scientific aspects of yoga. These are the two disciples of Krishnamacharya, and in particular Gune or Kubalayananda, who founded the Kaivalidam Yoga Ashram in Lonavala, tried to combine the medical aspects of yoga with, let's say, traditional ideals around yoga's meanings, by merging therapeutic aspects and the study of Sanskrit texts and Western science. So when we look at global yoga today, the issues of capitalism and freedom and economic competition also arise. But as there is expressed before, there's more and more freedom and individuality in the behavior of modern subjects, and the people are free to choose their own religious backgrounds or their own religious practices in what Alclas referred to as the logic of religious bricolage. And also yoga becomes commodified more and more through the process of branding. And Jain says that branding mythologizes yoga products and services, ranging from mats and pants to styles and teachers, and thus they come to signify various meanings to consumers. And also the yoga community is not bounded by national or identitary borders, but they constitute a worldwide community or a transnational community of people or an imagined somatic community. So again, ideas of neoliberalism and self-development are central, insofar individuals are more and more actively engaged in politics through their personal conduct, including taking care of one's own health and well-being. And especially modern postural yoga is focused on the physical performativity, where body enhancement reflects a desire for self-enhancement, which is seen as personal success, while the failure to take care of one's own body and health is seen as an individual failure and as a form of guilt almost. So yoga becomes more and more popularized as a portable practice, like Lucia expressed, and is initially promoted as a non-religious practice accessible to everyone, but still it often leads to spiritual conversion. So the main aspect I want to look at is this shift from, let's say, ancient forms of yoga where aspects of asceticism and detachment and liberation refer to freedom as a form of freedom from, so detaching oneself from the self and from society, compared to contemporary forms of yoga, which are more aimed towards agency and success, so a form of freedom which can be seen as a freedom too, as a form of self-creation and achievement of social status and identity, which is in one way paradoxical, but also is interesting to look at. So as Godrej expressed also, modern postural yoga may creatively align with the biopolitical imperatives as the language of yogic self-discipline converges with neoliberalism, self-surveillance, self-monitoring, and self-mastery. So also if we look at the media, you can find many words like purpose, action, being connected, being energized, increasing focus and productivity, and quality of life. And yoga is supposed to help achieve all these different goals. So if we look at the different spaces or scapes inhabited by yoga today, there's many different realms from nature, the media, and society. For example, yoga is said to allow for a deeper and more empathic relation with the environment, with the many offers like this liquid roots retreat at the Azores, but also yoga in public space, for example, practicing in the main squares of big cities, and also performing a sort of ritual, public ritual. Yoga in schools. So it's interesting to look at yoga's educational potential, both for the Indian and for the non-Indian youth. And also recently has been, yoga departments have been open in Indian departments, and it will be interesting to look at them probably. Another space is that of the yoga studio, which is both a constructed and factitious space, but also a space for self-creation and self-transformation. Cosmopolitan yoga studios present a non-religious nature, so they tend to be minimal and neutral and open for creative interpretation. But still they sometimes include religious symbols like Buddhas or Om and so on. Then yoga in the media is proliferating a lot. You can find different offers which have different aims or approaches. For example, more motivational and inspirational, like Twist Your Way to Bliss, Change Your Perspective, or Total Reset, or more body-oriented practices like yoga for tight neck and shoulders and Wake Up Your Spine, and so on. So if we look at the Indian context, yoga is linked to nationalism, health, and identity politics. For example, with Baba Ramdev's yoga camps and the establishment of the International Yoga Day, International Yoga Day, and there would be a lot to say about these, but the main aspects are that of yoga being a public and collective tool, both for achieving national identity, but also for making yoga a global commodity or a global form of self-representation. So now finally I come to the topic of yoga festivals. And here are my self-reflective consideration before starting my potential research. I asked myself how to position my own research, since the topic of festival can be so broad. and I think I should focus on directing my research questions to a specific public, let's say. So I asked myself, who is going to benefit from my work, and to which academic debate do I want to contribute? Considering that festivals and yoga festivals in particular can touch on many different aspects of society. For example, they can be seen as new forms of religious practices in the form of retreats, conferences, yoga fairs, and yoga camps. But also they represent and they propose different visions of Indianness and what being Indian means. They are linked to the topic of performing spirituality. They're linked to politics, but also to the media and the media spiritual tourism as well. So in my research, I also would like to avoid risks like essentializing or reifying Indian values like spirituality, liberation, but try to have a more direct approach by talking to practitioners and trying to have many windows of what modern forms of yoga are. And my case study will be the International Yoga Festival in Rishikesh. Here are some basic facts about the festival. The two main actors are Pujya Swami Chidanand, this one, and Sadhvi Bhagavati Saraswati ji. And it's held annually since 1989, and since 1999 it's held at Parmat Niketan Ashram. And it hosts more than 2,000 participants from 100 countries, 200 classes, over 80 presenters from 20 countries. And the main activities are asana and meditation classes, spiritual lectures, health and environmental camps, dance performances, chanting, religious ceremonies, and so on. And these are some of the sponsors: Incredible India, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Ayush, and Government of India, which is also interesting to look at the sponsors to see how many actors and aspects are involved. So this is from the 2018 brochure. We can find interesting narratives, like, for example, Rishikesh being the yoga capital of the world and in the lap of the Himalayas, and offering the teaching, touch, and transformation of yoga. Also, the Mother Ganga purifying past actions and conveying inner peace and harmony, bringing together nationalities, creating a universal family, spreading love, awakening inner self, and yoga festivals participants being the chosen ones. So many different romanticized and also nostalgic narratives about being at the yoga festival as a sort of chance for not only for self-transformation, but also for changing the whole of society. And like you can see in this quote from one participant of the past edition, saying that coming back to the yoga festival opens our hearts and souls, and it's a possibility for transforming our life into a living blessing, create altogether a better world, or be our best selves, and so on. So behind all these nostalgic and romanticized narratives, it will be interesting to look at the political strategies that are hidden. And so I come to my research questions, maybe. These are other quotes. For example, authentic origins of yoga, practice and learn from masters from traditional yoga lineages, as well as masters of international yoga schools and styles. And here are my yoga questions. So, firstly, who are the organizers of yoga festivals? What kind of power relations structure their organization? Who are the participants? Are they mostly male or female? Are they mostly Indian or non-Indian? What are the motivations and aspirations of practitioners and organizers? What are the main differences and similarities between Indian and non-Indian festivals? What are the values transmitted by yoga festivals? So what image of yoga and image of India is given? Connected to this, is yoga presented mainly as a religious practice or as a secular practice? And how can ideals and practices on asceticism, morality, and liberation be integrated with modern capitalism and performatively presented at yoga festivals? And so finally, reassuming all this is how can the idea of a yogic self be enacted at yoga festivals as well as in the media? So finally, my conclusions. Yoga festivals reflect modern society's diversity by enhancing individual freedom, social exchanges, and contributing to the emergence of a global community of yogic selves. And during yoga festivals, participants are often imbued with Hindu supremacist views, promoting nostalgic nationalist narratives about India's authenticity. But also, at yoga festivals, yoga's soteriological aspects can be combined with neoliberal demands of self-care, social recognition, and economic freedom through the logics of religious bricolage and branding. So, capitalized yoga reinforces the sense of self by commodifying self-realization and collectively celebrating it on the public stage of yoga festivals, so that a global middle-class community can be established. And we can see all these different aspects in different lights. So there's both positive and negative conclusions one can come to. For example, that yoga festivals enhance cultural exchange, creativity, solidarity, and self-confidence. But also that this form of commodified yoga proposed at yoga festivals increases attachment to and identification with a sense of yogic identity, seen as a social status, and also increasing spiritual competition, privatization, and commodification of yoga. So one of the final questions one can ask oneself is whether at yoga festival the aim of yoga is still liberation, and if yes, what kind of freedom is eventually achieved, if at all. So thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay tuned for more episodes. In the meantime, please have a look at the Yogascapes in Japan website at yogascapesinjapan.com. Also, if you're feeling generous, please think about making a donation through the GoFundMe account linked to the website. Until next time.